Good evening, everyone. It's good to see everyone here and familiar faces. For those that don't know a lot about Trees Atlanta, although Tony did a great job, thank you, Tony. Trees Atlanta is a nonprofit community group that plants, protects, and educates people about the importance of trees. We've been around since 1985 doing this great work. We have a lot of volunteers here, including our volunteer associate director, Susan, in the audience. And one thing that organization does is, Tony, we plant trees, but we really do it with community. Over 44,000 volunteer hours, so a lot of y'all are those people that make the difference. So I want to thank everyone for doing what you do. And also wanted to thank City of Atlanta, because they do help sponsor our speaker series, as well as the Carter Library and Acapella Books. They are for sale. I just bought one, buy one. And they'll talk a little bit about one project that volunteers aren't as involved in, it's good for you to know what's going on. We are trying to plant 8,000 trees in downtown. We got some federal funding to do that. It's very exciting. 8,000 trees could change the canopy from downtown to about 3% to 20% in 15, 20 years. It's a big change. But to plant a tree in downtown, the cost is like almost $6,000. We have a lot of soil volume, make it so that you have inhabitable for roots underneath the sidewalks. So in order to do what Brian's going to tell you we need to do, there is a cost to it, but of course we all know the payback is tenfold. So just wanted to let you know about that project, and although I'm not supposed to really advocate, if you notice what the DOT is doing, you might want to give your congresspeople a call, because the DOT is doing a number in Atlanta, but all over the state, and I don't think they're hearing much from the public about it. And that's all I'm going to say, and now I'm going to introduce Brian Stone. Brian Stone was a past board member for 6 years, so we have known each other for quite a while, and he's a great guy. He's also a professor at the School of City and Regional Planning at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he teaches urban environmental planning and directs the Urban Climate Lab. Brian's research program is focused on urban scale drivers of the climate change and has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. His work is regularly featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and on National Public Radio. He is the author of The City and the Coming Climate Change in the Places We Live, which received the Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award, and recently published The Radical Adaptation, Transforming Cities for a Climate Change World by Cambridge University Press. You can buy that book. Stone holds environmental management and urban planning degrees from Duke University and Georgia Institute of Technology. And welcome, Brian, and it's good to have you back.
Thank you, Greg. I've known Greg much longer than I joined the board. I think I've known him since he was planting his first trees with Trees Atlanta, a long time ago. What a total thrill to be here. Thank you for coming out on a Wednesday night. Very, very excited to be here in the Carter Presidential Center. That is a true honor. And particularly given the focus of the talk tonight. And so I'm going to be talking about fundamentally transformation. And it's exciting for me to do that in my own, not just my chosen city, but my native city. And so I've been around Atlanta for a long time. I've seen it change. I've seen transformation in real time. And so I wanted to start with that theme. For any of you who haven't been in Atlanta that long, you may not know what this is. So this strip at Peachtree Street, from 10th Street to 14th Street, was known affectionately around the time when I showed up in Atlanta, when I was born, as the Hip Strip. And so the Hip Strip was our little counterculture geography. And it was compared to our little Greenwich Village or our Haight-Ashbury down in the south in Atlanta. And so this region has now been, this part of the city has been transformed. It's transformed from the kind of the center of the counterculture to the center of the corporate culture. One of many centers of the corporate culture. So not many hippies today found down here, King and Spalding and other of these corporate clients. And so transformation doesn't always happen in the direction that we might find most exciting. We can look at a few other examples. We had a minor league baseball team here in Atlanta, in a place that probably looks pretty familiar. This has now been transformed from a minor league team to a major league headache, if you've ever spent any time in this parking lot. So very different feel. Transformation happens. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. We're just in the background here, Ponce City Market, very positive transformation. It's not exactly the story I'm telling right at this moment. And then one more, we had the center of the global 24-hour news ecosystem is being transformed right now. You guys know what it's being transformed into? The center. Yeah, the center. So transformation doesn't always come about in exciting ways. It doesn't always move us into the aspirational city we might want. But it's always happening. It's particularly always happening in Atlanta. And it seems to be accelerating in Atlanta. And so we know that Atlanta is going to receive a lot of climate migrants from the US, internal domestic migrants. And the reasons for that are, well, there are many, but it's not always appreciated that we have more coastline in the southeast than in any other part of the country. And it's also not always recognized that sea level rise is, of course, happening everywhere. It's happening along the southern Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast more rapidly than anywhere else in the world. These are the most rapidly rising seas. And so this is already started a pattern of displacement, already started a pattern of movement. And Atlanta will be receiving many of these migrants. It's estimated that we might receive more than anybody else. And so as we're doing that, we're already positioned to grow rapidly. We are growing rapidly. And so the challenge becomes, can we accept population from other places that are fleeing vulnerability without deepening our own vulnerability? And it is possible. We do have a model for this, and that model is actually the industrial city of the US. And so it doesn't look like a public health story, like a public health victory, but this period of the industrial city, the mid to late 19th century in the United States, was a period of extremely rapid population growth, much more rapid than we're going to see in Atlanta over the coming decades. And what was probably the most remarkable aspect of this period is that while these cities were growing rapidly, they were diminishing public health impacts, particularly waterborne disease. They were becoming more healthful places. I know it doesn't look like it from this image. But that was a rather tremendous thing to do. And so how that was carried out was a suite of strategies and technologies that are associated with what we call urban environmental management. And so a critical technology is familiar to everybody here, and that is the water carriage sewer system. And so this is this sewer system being constructed in London, one of the early examples. We have early examples from the US. And so what was so important about this strategy, this technology, was that not only did it convey our wastewater away from our homes and businesses, and particularly our wells within these urban areas, which were constantly contaminated and causing epidemics, it required that we have a greater acceleration of the deployment of indoor plumbing. Because a water carriage sewer system is a gravity-driven system. It has to have water flowing through it at all times. And so we need to have flushing toilets and sinks running and showers running all the time to flush it through. And so really we had multiple public works technologies coming about in the industrial city that were fundamentally important. We had the wastewater sewage carriage system. We had wastewater treatment plants. Ultimately, we first just used to let this outfall into rivers. But then we had our remediation plants, water purification plants, better treatment of solid waste in cities that were near along rivers or coastal areas. We had levees, a whole suite of adaptations of large, increasingly large industrial facilities that enabled us to manage some of the effects of really high density and rapid growth. And so this is positioning us in an interesting time today. The cities in the industrial city were not the first to use kind of large scale engineering to manage environmental issues. The Romans really did this at the same scale. And so ancient Rome approaches a population, it might have surpassed it, of 1 million residents. 1 million residents. And so with their technology, they also confronted the same kinds of challenges of wastewater and drinking water. And so the aqueduct system that we see here is a tremendous engineering feat that really would provide a basis for thinking about this later in the industrial city. But what distinguishes the ancient Roman cities from our contemporary cities, but also the industrial cities, is alongside these large engineered public work projects like the aqueducts, but also the sewer system in ancient Rome, they had these site scale, kind of building integrated solutions that were also focused on environmental management and moderating climate. And so what we see here is a kind of a classic courtyard house from Pompeii. This is excavated from Pompeii. And what you see in the foreground is this opening in the ceiling is designed to allow rainwater to come in. It's called an impluvium. And this is the drinking water source for the family that lives in the house. And so it's collected in this shallow pool you see here. There's an opening, there's a circular opening in the middle of this pool with a sand gravel filter. The rainwater filters through that. Rainwater was much cleaner in the Roman Empire than it is now. And then it would be collected in a subterranean reservoir, and you had cooled, purified water for the household. So it's very climate adaptive at the site scale. In the background of this, you see an opening. That's the courtyard. The house was built around this, a courtyard house. And that courtyard also has a really important climatic function. It's got stonework in it, and it's got this differential shading from the columned arcade around it. And so during the course of the day, that courtyard would heat up, and you'd have rising air, and you'd have convective air movement. It wouldn't feel so refreshing to us with our mechanical air conditioning, but it really made a big difference in terms of adaptability, in terms of climate adaptability. And so in the ancient Roman city, you had both of these strategies simultaneously. The large public works facilities, the site-specific kind of traditional adaptations that allowed you to manage climate issues, environmental issues. And so today we're really confronted with a choice because we are having to manage increasingly intense weather, rainfall patterns, hurricanes, extreme heat. And so we can choose how we do that. We're going to absolutely need to adapt in some way. One of those strategies is just to scale up our existing urban environmental management systems. Like we see here, these deep water tunnels. We have these in Atlanta, of course, to deal with our stormwater problems. This also helps us deal with increased rainfall over time, which is getting much and much more intense. And so we can build more of these facilities, but it does come with a cost. And so I'm arguing, for the sake of interest, that this is what we should call conventional climate change adaptation. Taking our existing systems for environmental management and scaling them up for a greater set of climate-related stresses. And so we can call this conventional environmental management, conventional climate change adaptation. But again, we are skilled at doing this. We can scale these systems up, and they can be rendered effective for some of the climate challenges that we confront. But again, they come with costs. One of those costs is centralization. That by centralizing these large facilities, we render these climate stressors or these weather changes invisible to us. And so we bury the infrastructure that transports the wastewater and the rainwater away. We put our landfills outside the city, and so we don't have to confront our solid waste very often, other than putting it in the trash can. And then, of course, when we centralize these large facilities, they have externalities for us, right? They have externalities for the communities they're sited in. And so we know that traditionally in the US, we have a horrible track record, one of disparity in the siting of these large facilities. They are sited in a disproportionate way. They're disproportionately sited in Black and brown communities, low-income communities. And so conventional climate adaptation, as I'm framing it here, if we go down this path, has another cost, which is in the form of marginalization. It tends to be marginalizing, both for the communities that receive these large facilities and for the ecosystems in which they are sited. If the large kind of engineered public works facility is the solution to the problem of the industrial city. The conventional suburb can be understood as the solution to the problem of these large engineered facilities. They mandate a certain standardized design. And so, this is the reflection in the popular culture. Sometimes we think of sprawl, suburban development as unregulated development. This is the most regulated, highly regulated settlement we've ever seen. And so it's regulated in part by the systems that support it. And so we need to have a hydrological connection between the gutter and the downspout and the driveway and the catch basin and the street. We have to have street widths to accommodate emergency vehicles and garbage collection. We have to ensure that trees are not positioned so they interfere with power lines or buried utilities. There are many aspects of modern development, particularly suburban development, that are standardizing. And they're standardized because, in part, they have to respond to these large engineered systems that have to interface with them in standardized ways. And so standardization also has a cost. I'm in planning. If you're in planning, you're well steeped in these costs, and we talk about a lot in our classes. And then lastly, a fourth cost implication of these systems and of scaling these systems to deal with environmental problems is that they tend to be pretty immobilizing. We do not have settlement patterns today that are able to shift in response, physically shift in response to rising seas and other kinds of climate stressors that are increasing. What you're seeing here are homes on a barrier island in North Carolina that are falling into the ocean, not during a hurricane, just during the annual high tide. And so we are somewhat immobilized by these systems, and we need to be thinking about how to be more adaptive and malleable in the way we build our settlements, but also in the processes that are needed to pull them back. And so these are aspects of conventional climate adaptation that we need to be thinking through in terms of what it means for our vulnerability moving forward. It's kind of a classic graphic of climate vulnerability. And what this shows is that as the climate is stable for a long period of time, which we assumed it always would be, of course, we've designed our cities based on design threshold. The most familiar one is a design storm. We determine the diameter of our stormwater sewer pipes under the ground based on a typical storm or an extreme storm based on the history of weather in a stable climate. And so that's that critical threshold here. As we shift into an unstable climate, which we already have, we need to have a shift in our adaptive mechanisms, right? We need to have this blue box come in. And so we have our governing institutions, and we change our design standards, we change our emergency response protocols. And so I think what most distinguishes the present moment, or most characterizes it, is that we're here where we've shifted into an unstable climate, but we haven't adapted. We haven't adapted our governing institutions. We have no national adaptation plan in the United States. We don't have a resilience plan in the city of Atlanta. We certainly don't have one in Georgia. And so this is another kind of vulnerability. We have a vulnerability that's rooted in environmental change, and then we have a vulnerability that's rooted in governmental incapacity. And I would say at the moment we are kind of equally vulnerable to both. And so in this book, the idea of radical adaptation, the word radical comes from not an exhortation to have an uprising, not even the idea that we need to have extreme new innovative technologies. It's really rooted in a tradition in planning called radical planning theory. If you're any of my former students here, you thought you were done with this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But radical planning theory is helpful to us because it speaks about transformation. And it largely addresses the same idea that sometimes societal stress and change is exacerbated by the rigidity of governing institutions, an inability to change to address a new problem, an unwillingness to change to address a new problem, the persistence of a set of practices that are no longer useful. And so to be radical in thinking about adaptation is to think more in terms of transformational terms, both in terms of what we do physically in cities and also how we make decisions about it and our governing institutions responding to it. And so that's where the idea of radical adaptation comes from. And so for each of these characteristics of conventional climate adaptation, this traditional urban environmental management, which has tended to be in history, centralizing, marginalizing, standardizing, and mobilizing, radical adaptation seeks to be dispersive, spatially dispersive, reparative, non-normative, and deconstructive. And so we're going to walk through each of these with examples. And I'm going to also, with each, reference one of these three drivers of change that we see in every city, whether you're coastal or non-coastal, whether you're in the US or out of the US, every city is having to deal with extreme levels of heat, extreme levels of water, either too much or too little, or too much and too little at the same time, which is what California's been dealing with. It's pretty challenging. And then retreat, and by retreat I mean something more general than the coastal image I showed you of the barrier islands. Every city is going to need additional space for adaptive infrastructure. Adaptation will require space. And so all cities are going to need to have some process of retreat, some process of finding space. And so what I'm going to argue through this talk is that that process of acquiring new space and transforming it has the potential to be a catalyst for many things we want and need in cities that is not just simply climate adaptation. And so it really becomes an opportunity for us. I already promised tonight that it would be an upbeat talk. So I'm going to have upbeat processes in here, upbeat ideas. Okay, heat as the first climate stressor to look at. Of all of the climate stressors I'll talk about, heat is the most ill-suited to our conventional approaches at adaptation. We're not able to, have our heat funneled down into a catch basin, transported to a heat remediation plant. We can't put it in a garbage truck and truck it out to a landfill. We have to confront heat in the places where we find it. And we find it in all places, right? We find extreme heat throughout the city, seasonally. And so we must deal with it. And so this is a somewhat famous image from the 2015 US Open. Jack Sock, an American tennis player, passed out, physically blacked out during a match in the US Open from heat and humidity that just was not safe to play in. And what most distinguished this US Open was that a number of athletes simply said they were not going to compete. They retired, not from the game, but from the tournament, because it just wasn't safe. And they had good advice that they shouldn't compete. It was too dangerous. And so when it's too dangerous for young, healthy, fit athletes to safely compete, that is an unsafe situation, but it's also an indication that we need to have responses for heat, not just in athletics, not just in the Olympics this summer in Paris, but we're going to be testing certainly how we adapt to heat in sports. But heat in general is just the most threatening climate-related issue, and it's not even close how it compares to others. And so this is looking over a 5-year period. How many people died? This is not the upbeat part of the talk. How many people died from hurricanes on average per year? How many died in the US from tornadoes? It's usually less than 100. We have some years where we have a really intense hurricane, and that number will be higher for sure. But on average, we look over a 5 to 10 period, it tends to be under 100 people a year. Heat-related illness, we think, is about 12,000 a year. And this has long been true that heat has been the most threatening climate risk we have, or at least extreme temperature, extreme cold is threatening too. And so heat is something increasingly that is going to be highly, highly problematic to the way cities function. And so one of the key questions around heat is, what is the threshold temperature when it's just not safe to be outside? Because unlike hurricanes and tornadoes and other kinds of threatening weather, heat is the only weather for which we have a physiological limit that we can't exceed. It's a hard number, and we can't exceed it. We can't be outside safely. And so what is that number? And what is the number for different groups of people? We've had a theoretical limit, but we never tested it in the laboratory. And so we've had these recent studies just a couple years ago that have been testing this. And so what they're doing is they're bringing young volunteers into environmental chambers. This is at Pennsylvania State University. And they're having them have moderate exercise, and they're slowly raising the temperature and the humidity in the environmental chamber. And what they're doing is they're measuring the wet bulb temperature, which is not a metric everybody knows, but it's like a heat index. It's responsive to both humidity and heat and wind speed and solar radiation, but the details don't matter so much. Wet bulb temperature is important because it's the only temperature metric that's calibrated to our ability to sweat. And when there's too much humidity in the air, we can't sweat. There's just not enough room in the atmosphere for more evaporation from our skin. And if we can't evaporate water from our skin, we can't cool ourselves down. And so we have environmental conditions where our physiologic adaptive functions don't work. And if they don't work, we start to see an increase in core body temperature. And so what they're measuring here with these little dots is the core body temperature of a volunteer. And what they're showing here is at this wet bulb temperature of 30.5 degrees Celsius or 87 degrees Fahrenheit, that doesn't relate to any kind of temperature you've ever considered or experienced. 87 degrees Fahrenheit is about 105 degrees and 60% relative humidity. We see 60% relative humidity in Atlanta for sure, never in the late afternoon. When it gets hot outside, you don't have high relative humidity. There are reasons for that, but we can talk about it later if you want to. But so temperature and humidity tend to be inversely related. And so if you've got really high humidity and really high temperature, that's incredibly dangerous. No US city has ever hit 87 degrees Fahrenheit. Chicago heat wave 1995, most deadly heat event still in the United States, we think, was about 83 degrees wet bulb temperature. So this is really extreme. So how close are we getting to this temperature where a healthy, fit person would get a fever just from being outside for an hour? That's what they found here. You would get a fever if you're outside for 1 hour. We looked at this in the Urban Climate Labs, my research group at Georgia Tech, for last summer, hottest summer ever. Most summers are these days. And we wanted to see how close were we to this threshold at the highest wet bulb temperature for the whole summer. The 1 hour, that was the most extreme hour. And we find that many large cities are getting close to this threshold, within just a couple degrees. And then we asked, if trends continue, how many years will it be until Cincinnati, Kansas City, Chicago, Dallas, how many years until they hit this threshold if they warm as they have been recently? It's about 2 to 4 years. So it's quite likely a city will hit 87 degrees Fahrenheit wet bulb temperature this summer. It probably won't be Atlanta. Atlanta was 81, so we have a little room to play with. But this is the threshold temperature for young, fit people. That's not the temperature for me. The temperature for me is lower, for sure. And so when we start hitting this temperature, this means basic municipal services cannot safely operate. We can't gather garbage. We can't have trash collection. We can't have outdoor construction. We can't have outdoor athletics. This is going to be very paralyzing for cities, and most cities aren't measuring it and don't know what's happening. So again, this is not the upbeat part of the talk, but I'm going to get there. I'm pivoting there. But we need to know where we are, and so heat is a big challenge. Heat is a big challenge. So what can we do to cool a city? Well, we can do lots. We partnered with the City of the Urban Climate Lab last summer, to look at how much we could cool things down by doing exactly what Greg was talking about, planting these trees in downtown Atlanta, but planting trees in all of our neighborhoods, really. And so we asked a basic question that I'm showing you here. Now, this is showing you air temperature for different neighborhoods in town, Atlanta neighborhoods. And so we said, what if we had every neighborhood in Atlanta have the median level of tree canopy? So basically, we bring up, these in-town neighborhoods tend to have a more sparse tree canopy. If we bring them up to kind of the average or median level for neighborhoods in Atlanta, how much would that cool things down? Tremendously. And so these neighborhoods you see here, the average temperature over the course of the summer would decrease by about 4 to 5 degrees. That's a big deal. If that translates into 4 to 5 degrees of wet bulb temperature, that'll buy us a decade, another decade at least, 15 years to adapt. And so this is a big deal. This is totally achievable. And again, so Trees Atlanta is working on this, of course, working on this downtown. And so we also asked, what would be the health impacts? What would be the benefits if we planted trees in these neighborhoods? We looked at every neighborhood in Atlanta, the 248, if you didn't know that. There are a lot of neighborhoods in Atlanta. Some of them have cool names like Just Us. If you haven't looked at a list of Atlanta neighborhoods, some great names. These are these in-town neighborhoods that I was showing you on that map. And so we said, well, what if we lose more trees? We didn't put a timetable. We just said, if we lost 10% of the canopy in each of these neighborhoods, how much would that increase heat-related mortality? In some neighborhoods, it was as high as 20%. But if we increase tree canopy and we met this goal of 60% of plantable space, that's not 60% of the neighborhood. That's 60% of the places where you can plant trees, where you don't have buildings or water. If you met that goal, and again, 40% of Atlanta neighborhoods already meet that goal. They're already there, right? To city and forest, we already meet that goal. So we could reduce heat-related mortality by about a third on average, more than 40% for a lot of neighborhoods. These are attainable things we can do and need to be focused on, are focused on, but we're going to have to scale it up to really have a meaningful impact. Can we put trees in dense neighborhoods? Yes, absolutely. This is not an Atlanta neighborhood. This is in Chicago. But we can fully shade streets at midday. Where the trees goes really matters. We need to be putting them near streets and parking lots. We need to be shading this impervious cover. But it's actually not technically that hard to do. It's not cost-free. It's definitely, Greg was mentioning $6,000 per tree. That's a lot of money per tree. That's a lot of money. But if you look at the budgetary implications of that, it actually is not more than we spend on many aspects of city governments, particularly dealing with our stormwater system. So it is quite possible. We do have levers we can pull, but those levers are not large, centralized environmental management systems. And so the first principle of radical adaptation is that we need to be spatially dispersive, not centralized in our approaches. This is a plan for Hamburg, Germany, a dense city. It's aspirational. They're really excited about green roofs. They think green roofs are really cool. And they have buildings that are well set up to have a lot of green roofs, and so they are deploying green roofs everywhere. They also have lots of trees and other kinds of vertical greenery that are incorporated in their cities. And so they are not here yet, but they are moving in this direction. If you look at Stuttgart, they have green roofs everywhere. That's today, everywhere. And so this is important and it's effective because it is putting green space not somewhere in large quantities. It's not building a new central park. It's putting green space everywhere you can. Because we have to tackle heat everywhere where it is intensified by the built environment itself. And so we need to be dispersive. So that's this first idea. Okay, water. Too much, too little, too much and too little at the same time. 2002, September, in Vine City and surrounding areas, tropical storm Hannah. It wasn't a hurricane. It wasn't the residual hurricane. It was a tropical storm. Deposited about 4 to 5 inches in 24 hours in Georgia. That seemed like a lot then. It doesn't seem like so much now. Was really catastrophic for several blocks in Vine City. For a couple of reasons. One, Vine City is just downslope from downtown. Downtown is incredibly impervious, and so all that runoff goes somewhere. It doesn't all go into the catch basins. A lot of it goes down into these near West Side neighborhoods. But these near West Side neighborhoods are positioned in a natural wetland, and so they flood easily. And so these houses, maybe you can see this station wagon here was fully submerged. And what it was submerged in was rainwater and wastewater. The combined storm sewer and sewer system overflowed. And so these houses flooded from the inside out. Toilets were exploding with wastewater, shower drains, sinks. Some people had to flee out their windows. It happened very fast. Some of the catch basins were just geysers of wastewater into the neighborhood. And so I tell you that not to gross you out, but to note that these houses just weren't salvageable. They really could not be rebuilt. And so the city had a choice to make, and that choice was whether to restructure the combined sewer system, which it took a court to mandate for different reasons. And they've chosen in many areas of the city not to do it because it's so expensive, or to buy out the property owners. And so they bought out the property owners. It was an eminent domain process. They required everybody to move. It wasn't safe to stay. And so this is an early example of retreat in Atlanta, Georgia, a long way from the coast. And so I mentioned that this is a natural wetland. This is these near West Side neighborhoods. And so these blocks where the house is flooded were over here. in this part. This is Josie Boone today. It's a different name. This is 1892. And you can see here there are 5 different streams that come into these blocks. And so these neighborhoods were initially settled by African Americans in the mid to late 19th century. And this land was made available for that reason, for African American settlement, because it was a wetland. It flooded all the time. It wasn't particularly good for agriculture, and so it was made available for that purpose. Part of the beginning of a marginalization that continues to this day, of course. And so it's a very flood-prone part of the city. It's the headwaters of Proctor Creek watershed. And so dealing with this is challenging. And so Atlanta has come up with some really effective strategies to deal with this. And so this is showing you before and after the flood, after the homes were acquired and torn down because they really couldn't be salvaged. And this land, of course, today has become Rodney Cook Senior Park. It took, the better part of 20 years to do it. And it took a really excellent plan by Park Pride to make this possible. And it's a tremendous resource. It's like the historic Fourth Ward, Stormwater Park. But it's important in that it doesn't just deal with the flood risk on these parcels that were acquired by the city. This drains the surrounding neighborhoods. And so the retreat that happened here has increased the resilience for the neighborhoods around it. And that should be a core focus of any managed retreat program. The city has never called it that. They might not like me calling it that now, but that's what it is. And so this is a phenomenal project, not just because it uses a nature-based strategy to deal with a flooding problem. It's the most effective way to deal with a flooding problem, and it's the most cost-effective way to deal with a flooding problem, and it's an amenity for the neighborhoods. But what most distinguishes this from other cities is where it happened. You look at Vine City, this is part of our analysis from last summer. We ranked every neighborhood, 248 in Atlanta, based on their climate vulnerability in terms of both extreme heat and extreme flooding. You can go to our website, urbanclimate.caltech.edu, to look at how your neighborhood ranks. You can see what the risk is in your neighborhood. Just click on it. And so Vine City was the 3rd most vulnerable neighborhood in the city, number 3. It's also one of the lowest income neighborhoods, right? This is an area that is highly vulnerable across multiple metrics. And so for Atlanta to make this investment, this adaptive infrastructure investment in one of its most marginalized neighborhoods is actually really unusual. What we usually see is these adaptation projects are in the most affluent neighborhoods. So I'll give you a couple examples. New Orleans, again, 20 years after Hurricane Katrina, is investing right now in a big stormwater park like Rodney Cook Park. And it's about the same capacity. And they have located in one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city. And so there's lots of flood risk in New Orleans. You can pretty much put it anywhere and have a benefit. But this is going into one of the most affluent parts of the city. And so this is not the most vulnerable part of the city. This is not where the most vulnerable residents are. Another example, New York, Million Trees campaign. I don't know whether Trees Atlanta is excited when I pick on New York and their tree planting. But this was one of the great wonders of the planning world that was rolled out during the Bloomberg administration in 2007. They decided to plant 1 million trees in a city where we would think it'd be hard to plant trees, and it is, in 10 years. And not only did they do it in 10 years, they did it in 8 years. They planted 1 million trees. Tremendous. It was to deal with heat risk and flood risk. The challenge was they tended to put the trees in the more affluent parts of the cities that didn't have the greatest vulnerability. Why did they do that? They didn't plan to do it that way. That's where the green space is. There's more green space in more affluent neighborhoods. It is easier and less expensive to put trees in green spaces. And so disproportionately, they put trees in the communities that already had trees in green space. And so, again, it's not out of any, I think, negative agenda, but to be investing in adaptation in the most vulnerable neighborhoods should be a key focus of adaptation. And so radical adaptation, it's not that much of a radical idea, is reparative. It identifies the most vulnerable neighborhoods, which are almost always the most historically marginalized neighborhoods, for investment. Prioritization in time, prioritization in scale of investment. These neighborhoods come first. I call it the least first principle. Those communities that have the lowest level of adaptive capacity need to be the initial principal focus of these investments. This is Park Pride Plan, amazing, from 2010. And you can see it also illustrates this other principle of being dispersive. And so what's highlighted here became Rodney Cook Park, several other smaller scale floodable parks today, an entire network, which is effectively restoring a wetland ecosystem at the headwaters of the Proctor Creek. It is the most effective way to deal with flood risk in a natural wetland, and it is increasingly working, and it is bringing lots of benefits to Vine City and surrounding neighborhoods that are not just environmental. Okay, retreat. If I tell you this is New Orleans, which it is, you might think this is Hurricane Katrina. It's not. This is a flood in 2018. And so after Katrina in 2005, tremendous investment in the hurricane protection system. They raised levees, they put in storm surge gates, and that barrier system has not failed since. It is working. It's probably not going to work forever, but it is working. New Orleans now floods much more commonly than it used to, much more frequently. New Orleans floods like this every year. The risk of flooding in New Orleans every year is 100%. And that is because the system, the environmental management system that's in place, is simply not designed for the level of rainfall that New Orleans is getting today. So it's famously a bowl-shaped city. It's surrounded by water at a higher elevation than it itself is situated at. And so it has a whole network of pumps. Famously, the pumping system has failed during critical events, but even when the pumps are working, they cannot process stormwater fast enough to pump it into the lake and into the river. And so you have this flooding that's happening. And so one way to deal with this is with these large floodable parks, is to restore some of the natural wetland hydrology to these neighborhoods. This was a proposal in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, which you see here is known famously as the Green Dot Plan. And the mayor convened a commission. It was a pretty representative commission of neighborhood interests and business interests. And they met with the Dutch, and they had experts come in and talk about, in addition to these flood defenses, how you can deal with flood risk in these neighborhoods. They said you really need to have more green space, these floodable parks. And they rolled out this plan in the worst possible way. No community engagement. They broke the golden rule of community planning. They talked about the where before they talked about the what. You never do that. You always have a process engaging communities around this. And so if you lived in one of these neighborhoods, these lowest lying neighborhoods are also the majority African American neighborhoods because they're in the lowest lying neighborhoods like in Atlanta. And so this was kind of dead on arrival with the city council and did not move forward. And so they just focused on the flood defenses. And so some of these neighborhoods that are pictured here, the neighborhood names aren't up, have rebounded and thrived since Katrina, but others haven't. And so most famously, the lower Ninth Ward today is still characterized more by vacancy than occupancy. And you can see, this is on the eve of the storm in 2005. This was a very solid, well-populated, healthy, working and middle-class neighborhood in New Orleans. And it has not recovered well. And the reason it hasn't recovered well, in part, is because many families had to simply abandon their properties. Because the cost of clearing the land and rebuilding, particularly if you don't have insurance, is exorbitant. It is more cost-effective to just walk away. And so New Orleans chose not to have a process of forced buyouts, and I can understand why in the emotional aftermath of an event that is not a popular topic, and I don't think that would have been the ideal approach at that time. But it's a useful counterfactual to think about what would have been the effect of having maybe voluntary buyouts for families that could have had some kind of an economic payback for their loss of property, which many people did not, and the amassing of land for flood control. Because what we have here is this irregular pattern of houses that doesn't enable the assembly of land to build a large enough floodable park to manage the flood risk. And so, today in the lower Ninth Ward, this is what it looks like when you have a 10-year storm. A 10-year rain event happens every couple of years. It's not 10 years. So this is kind of a typical rain event. This is how much flooding you get. If there had been a buyout program, and land had been assembled, not only would you have enabled those families to recoup some economic value and move them out of harm's way, you would have increased the resilience of the neighborhood for those who stayed. And so we kind of got a lose-lose situation. The households that had to abandon their properties got no economic return, and they should have. And then the remaining residents have no greater resilience today than they did in 2005. In fact, it's probably lower. They're probably flooding more. And so retreat is defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as the abandonment of land and structures in vulnerable areas and resettlement of inhabitants. And that's the definition that governs today. This is half of what we should expect from retreat. Retreat should move families and businesses out of harm's way. It should not abandon land. That land should be assembled into adaptive infrastructure. It should enhance resilience for the remaining community. And if you're doing one and not doing the other, you're not doing retreat in an effective way. This is something that the Dutch understand. And so famously, their Room for the River program is all about this. This is Nijmegen in Netherlands, where they have a large open river, the Wall River. And instead of building up the levees, like they've done in New Orleans, they've pushed the levees back. They recognize that you can't contain the rising waters and the rising rainfall, and so you have to make more room for it. You have to accommodate it. You have to accommodate this natural system that's shifting. And so in doing that, you used to have a levee along the shoreline on both sides. So the levee used to be here historically. They moved it back to the new position, and in doing that, these existing neighborhoods and communities had to be relocated. And so through their process of eminent domain, they provided fair market value, they relocate these families. They really had little choice because this would have regularly flooded. They already had several significant floods. In some cases, they moved entire neighborhoods together. Neighbors were able to remain next door neighbors on new land provided by the national government. And so, but they didn't simply move everybody out. They moved everybody out and they restructured the landscape to accommodate the river. And so they moved the levees back. They had this enhanced resilience. They lowered flood risk. So the remaining neighborhoods, of course, adjacent, are much more resilient today. And then they have developed a number of amenities on this reclaimed land. They use public dollars to acquire it. And so they have an expansion of their already incredibly robust biking network. If you like to bike, don't go there. You won't be able to come back to Atlanta. It is unbelievably fantastic to go biking in these communities. You can go all over the country. Never hit a traffic light. And they have public amphitheaters, parks, wildlife preserves. All of this land is increasing resilience and providing public amenities to the community. That is leveraging retreat in a way that is yielding real adaptive benefits for these communities. So radical adaptation is deconstructive. This is a term that we do not have in our vocabulary as planners. We do not deconstruct. We build, we expand, we grow, we build forever. We don't retreat. We have to have a language and a set of processes to enable us to deconstruct, retreat, reconstruct, and render our communities more resilient, but also more livable in different ways. Last few set of slides here. Adaptive urbanism, kind of a key idea in the book, which I just touched on. November of 2005 in the Mission District in San Francisco, a very unique experiment was carried out by a group of art students and urban activists, young folks, who lived in the neighborhood and were troubled by the lack of public space and became aware of how much of the Mission District was set aside for vehicle movement and vehicle storage, more than half. Right, and so that's kind of typical in a dense urban area, is that 40%, 50% of the land is for cars. And so they wanted to know what would happen if they claimed some of that back. They took one parking space. They did not ask the city. They did not ask the city. They went to their version of Home Depot, I don't know if it's Home Depot, and they got grass, not artificial turf, real turf, and a tree and a bench, and they rolled it out and they put these chains around it, so no cars would park on it, because of course a car would park on this if you didn't have the chains there. And then they went across the street to observe what happened. And what happened within just a few minutes was a guy's walking down the sidewalk, sees the bench, walks over to the bench, lights a cigarette, starts reading his paper. A few minutes later, another guy walks up and sits in the shade of the tree. And then, to their eternal delight and glee, these two individuals who presumably did not know each other started to have a conversation. And so this became a tremendous example that is celebrated every year in planning programs. At least it's called Parking Day. You can come down to the School of City and Regional Planning Parking Day on 5th Street every September. We do this. It happens in cities all over the world. And of course, this has been scaled. It's not just performative. It's now been scaled with an assist from the pandemic to streeteries and parklets. In New York, we have 50 linear miles of streeteries. This is reclaimed space from on-street parking. I'm sorry if you have a car, I have a car, so cars need space, but they can't have all the space. We have to have some of that space back because there are critical needs for it. And so, this not only is providing more retail space and dining space, it's space for greenery. And it's more than just having space for nice restaurants in New York. It is about finding space in cities for adaptive infrastructure. Some of that space in cities is going to have to come from the roads. And I apologize to your cars, but it's going to have to come. And so we need bioretention, we need bioswales, we need street trees, we need places to put these things because they are the most effective strategies we have to deal with both heat and stormwater. They're very, very effective, but we need space for them. And while we're doing that, we can improve options for mobility. We can improve livability, quality of life in cities, and the options we have. We can also improve affordability. This is a recent analysis of what was possible for affordable housing in New York, and they mapped what they characterize as underutilized lots. If you occupy one of these lots, you probably didn't appreciate it, but these were surface parking lots across New York and single-story commercial buildings. So again, I showed this to my students and they objected about losing the bodega down the block. And so I'm sympathetic with that, but we can retain that by having that on the first story. If we were to convert the surface parking lot in this market, this one-story market, into a multi-story building, affordable housing, we could find more space for about 1 million more New Yorkers. Affordable housing. It's one of the great challenges of cities today. It's a great challenge in Atlanta. And we cannot have these challenges be siloed. We have to think about them together. And so in becoming more affordable in this way, we can also become more resilient. And so this is a building, they show a green roof. You can have a green roof, you can have solar PV on the roof, you can have rainwater collection and use that rainwater to flush the toilet. And if you do that, you've made it even more affordable. Not only is the apartment more affordable, your utility bill is more affordable. You can retain the grocery, but you are going to lose some of the parking. And so this is what I call adaptive urbanism. It's recognizing that if our mission is to adapt to climate change alone, that mission will fail. We have to use that as a catalyst, and we have to use a process of retreat, which is going to require us to reclaim some of this land in cities, as a catalyst for enhancing resilience for everybody, making people whole, those that have to move. I'm not suggesting that we should forcibly have store owners and residents move. There's certainly a possibility to buy them out in a voluntary way. This is a similar project in Atlanta that's happening over in these near West Side neighborhoods, just reported on this week. Taking a vacant parking lot, we have a lot of those in Atlanta. Every day, this imposes costs on us. It makes the city hotter. It generates more stormwater. It's providing no economic revenue whatsoever, but a lot of cost for the community. If we can convert that, and this is happening, underway now, into affordable housing, but not just affordable housing that also has these resilient aspects to it, on-site renewable energy, addressing the energy insecurity of the residents, stormwater collection, green roofs. You can choose your palette of strategies, but by incorporating this into an affordable housing project, we make the housing more affordable. Resilient housing is more affordable, and affordable housing is more resilient because you have enhanced the adaptive capacity of the residents. They have more income that they can then leverage for other things. They may have more grid resilience if you operate as a microgrid. There are lots of potential benefits here. And so adaptive urbanism is related to this final principle. Radical adaptation is non-normative. We're going to have to do things somewhat differently. We don't have to radically change the design of cities, but many of our protocols, the way we develop, need to be shifted and carried out slightly differently. Okay, so I have been living in a city in a forest for a long time, or sometimes referred to Atlanta, over many years, and I've watched these transformations. I think for Atlanta's next chapter, she should aim to become a forest in a city. We're going to need to not only have our forest fragments and our neighborhoods with greenery, we're going to have to really incorporate more green space, more trees, more resilient architecture throughout the city. We can make Atlanta more resilient and more affordable and more livable and more just simultaneously. These long-standing goals will be more likely to be accomplished if we tether them together. That is it. Thank you very much for your attention. I would be most happy to answer any questions. I think we have a few minutes. And so if you have questions, I'll just call you out. Yeah?
The southeast in Atlanta, in particular, is a low tax area.
Well, so we are absolutely going to need some money for this. And so this is part of the reason why we need a federal framework to help deal with this. We have various pots of money, but we're going to need more. There's no cost-free way out of a changing climate. And so we're either going to absorb this in terms of the impacts, or we're going to have to find revenue for the conversion. Every study that I've seen says that these investments pay for themselves. And so, for example, the affordable housing project here, trying to go backwards. There we go. If we install a renewable energy system on this roof, it will pay itself back based on current array of subsidies within a handful of years. And then it will just generate revenue. So most of these kinds of adaptations pay for themselves. We spend a tremendous amount of money expanding our stormwater sewer system. So the cost of planting all the trees that we estimate are needed for the city of Atlanta would be 1% of our wastewater management budget every year in Atlanta, just 1%. That's hundreds of thousands of trees, street trees, 1%. We are spending a tremendous amount. You can see we're a low tax area. It's not true for our stormwater. And so we have raised revenue when we've had to, and we're doing it typically in the least efficient way. And so, the wonderful story of the historic Fourth Ward Stormwater Park is that it was found to be, after a lot of work by community advocates and some Georgia Tech graduates, to be the most cost-effective way. The initial strategy was to do kind of a deep tunnel strategy. And the park we got, which has all these amenities, was the lowest cost way. So I acknowledge your point, none of this is free. It's ultimately costly, but it's much, much less costly than dealing with the impacts.
Brian, remember to restate the question.
I'm going to restate the question.
Hey there.
Hi.
I appreciate the talk.
Sure.
I learned a lot. So, with some of these radical adoptions that you discussed, I can't help but think that there's one elephant in the room, specifically being that having road diets or rejuvenating old parking lots and turning them into something that's suitable for affordable housing, it reduces the ability for cars to transport people to get to work.
Yeah.
So do you see that the role of remote working would be conducive to helping these adoptions going forward?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I mean, let's means test this idea, right? Like many of us, most of us got here in cars. We use cars, I use cars. And so can we claw back some of this space? And again, it tends to be the on-street parking more than anything else. And then and still have an effective transportation system. I mean, if we were to do this overnight in Atlanta, we know our public transit system wouldn't be sufficient to move us all in the places we need to go. And so is remote work a viable solution here is the question as I understood it. And so, yeah, I mean, absolutely that the remote work situation right now is becoming an engine of more affordable housing in cities, and the initial forays into it dealing with the amount of commercial retail space we have that's underutilized now because of the pandemic and remote work. What it requires is a comprehensive set of plans and thinking. And so, I was talking earlier about the vulnerability of not having a federal presence around adaptation. I don't want to overdraw that. I mean, the federal government now is investing a tremendous amount in adaptive projects, but we don't have an agency we don't have a centralized office in the government that's thinking about adaptation and what it's going to require and how we really need to have a national framework for retreat to deal with this. We don't have that. And so ultimately, I think if we are striving for a set of urban goals, including greater mobility, greater affordability, greater livability, greater resilience, these become self-reinforcing. And so I do think there's a pathway to have road diets, to lose some of our parking, to make it possible for more of us maybe to own 2 cars instead of 1, to have a larger fraction of the population be able to live in Atlanta without a car. But we're going to have to stage these investments. We're going to have to we're going to need to deploy more of our transit system, and we're going to need to have expanded biking and other networks. So I'm not trying to be naive about it, but I do think this is a multi-decadal process. And over that timetable, we can provide the substitutions we need to enable us to claw back a little bit of this tremendous amount of land that we've put into vehicles. It's not the only place to look. I'm just picking on cars because that's what planners do. But I do think it is feasible to do these things and to, at the same time, render a city that we find to be more desirable in many ways. So, but would remote work be helpful? Hugely helpful. Hugely helpful. And it's hard to imagine that we're going to put that genie fully back in the bottle, although there are plenty of employers who are seeking to. So thank you for your question. Yes?
Materials. Like, I love the idea of more trees, of course, but can we look at other we look at some of this asphalt and other things, like what can we do to kind of change the material or change the planning around how we use these materials or a different material to kind of combat, rather than using a tree as canopy for shade? What are we doing with materials?
Yeah. So really important question. So, trees, the question is, sorry, Judy, the question is, are there a diversity of materials and strategies and ways we can make our cities more resilient? Is it just trees? Is it as easy as just trees or just that simple? And so, no, I mean, I've spent a lot of time doing work that's trying to tease out how effective trees are for heat relative to other strategies. And there is no other strategy that's more effective. But there's some places that trees just don't work. And so, again, it's a city with competing interests, and we looked at the numbers, it's going to be growing. And so having trees everywhere won't be viable everywhere. And so there are other strategies. One of those strategies is shade structures. And so we're seeing this in European cities, entire commercial corridor streets that have a canopy over them. And that also becomes a really viable place to put solar PV. You can have a canopy of solar PV over streets, over parking lots. We see some of this today. And so we need to have a diversity of strategies here that are less impactful or more adaptive than we have now. Trees are a wonderful strategy. We can use other kinds of greenery. We can use porous paving. We can use more reflective materials. There's a whole menu of options here. And so that's why it's really important that we're thinking about this in terms of neighborhood scale planning, because we have to see what the neighborhood wants, what works for the neighborhood. There are plenty of neighborhoods in Atlanta that don't particularly want trees. And there are good reasons for that. And so we have to be able to work in a collaborative way.
What are some good reasons for that? Why would we want to?
Well, so I mean, I'm not the best person to make this argument, but trees have been trees can be quite costly. So, Atlanta's a city where the city doesn't own and maintain the street trees. And so when the tree falls down, it can be your responsibility on your property. That's expensive. It may fall on your house. It's a threat. And so it can create economic insecurity. And so it really just depends on your perspective and your history. There are other cities where the cities maintain, they own the street trees. They plant them, you're not allowed to mess with them. When they get diseased and die, they replant them, they cut them down. That's not our way in Atlanta. And so there are, it's well documented, there's certainly communities that have real concerns about trees. And we should be aware of that and having that conversation. So I appreciate your question. All the way in the back.
Following up on that, so $6,000 per tree, is that immediately, or is that over 10 years, 100 years? And also, how long does it take for that average tree to actually be that very effective tool? Because a lot of these trees die within years of being planted because of all of the environmental things they're up against.
Yeah. So the question is about, what is the real cost of these trees? What's the cost of planting? Cited the $6,000 figure that Greg cited. I'm going to let Greg answer that. And then what is the cost over time? And it's a really critical question. Greg, do you want to? I don't know the specifics on the $6,000 figure. I assume that's planting street trees, having tree boxes.
Sure.
So
it's $6,000 in the most difficult situation, which is downtown, where you're removing concrete, you're putting infrastructure underneath the concrete so that you have a greater soil volume, so you can grow larger trees and also collect water. So that's the most expensive place. Planting a tree in the park, taking care of it for 2 years is $750 for a 2.5-inch caliper. And trees you plant in communities and neighborhoods are $300 for 2 years care. So it just varies, but the hardest, most difficult spots are $6,000.
Can we do a fact check before?
Oh, and also the city does maintain the street trees and they do own them.
in neighborhoods?
Yes, they do.
How are we defining street tree?
A tree that is in the right-of-way, the public right-of-way, the city does own, the city does maintain.
Okay.
But a lot of people, when they have financial hardships, don't want trees in their yards because the fear of it falling on their house and that their insurance may not cover it, or they'll lose their insurance, which happens often, is that insurance is, of course, skyrocketing all over the country.
Okay, great. We'll sidebar about this because I know of multiple instances where no city employee showed up to remove a tree. And so, yeah, that's great. That's great to know. I do want to just say one more though on this point. It's a really critical point. When we look at, I threw out this number of planting all these trees that we think we need in Atlanta and how that would compare to the stormwater budget. We use a figure of $100 per tree per year in perpetuity. And so, of course, there's a greater cost in that first year, but it is essential that these trees be treated like infrastructure and maintained, right? Has to be the right tree, we have to create appropriate spaces for them, and we have to make that upfront investment, and then we have to maintain those and replace them. And so studies in other parts of the country find that to be per tree, $100 a year in perpetuity. That adds up to, a very large number for a large number of trees, but again, it's much less than we spend on storm sewers and other kinds of infrastructure. Okay, maybe, I don't know about time, but maybe I'll do 2 more questions because I don't want to keep you guys too long here, and then I'll go over here.
A quick thought on the trees.
Yeah.
I had cherry laurels on the verge of my street, and the dirt power would cut them so they would lean over the street, and every time we had snow or ice, it would be a limb that would fall and hit down lines. So the city took them out. So it was under the Parks Department, and we ground them up, and that was it.
Good, glad to
I
hear
don't know
it.
what the plan under the lines are.
Yeah.
And the question I had is the conundrum I see when you talk about the low-income neighborhoods being in the bad places. What are we going to do about coastal Florida, where the wealthy live in the most vulnerable spots?
Yeah.
Those are going to be really expensive buyouts. And, you see, what is it, in Miami, they're beginning to buy property in Liberty region. So you get out because that's where higher ground, although it's not that high. Plus you've got the permeation.
Yeah, it's another question about the cost of this, and it's a very fair cost. It's a very fair question. My observation is, you look at these homes falling into the sea. What's the cost of that? And it's also a dysfunctional in terms of the governmental levels. The federal government won't come in and demolish those houses until we have a disaster declaration. If there's no hurricane, there's no disaster declaration. The state government says we've devolved this land use control to the local government. Local government says we can't force you to move your house or tear it down, but once it falls down, you have to pull it out of the ocean. And so, the property owners have found their cheapest option is to let the house fall in the ocean and let the septic fields, fail into the ocean. I mean, this is really problematic to not have a framework for this. And the set of costs is there whether we are proactive or reactive. We have great costs there. And so, I read about in the book this notion of lease first. So we may need buyouts. We certainly may need retreat in places where we have very affluent houses. It would not be probably the first place that I would offer those buyout programs. And so, that is going to be that staging and prioritization. So here, one more question. You're very patient. Yeah.
Okay, so I know that you're saying the forest and the city. So my question is, have we prepared for the animals that will be attracted to the new forest of the city?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that this is, part of a longer or a larger idea that cities need to be a part of their ecosystems, that we need to be more not only responsive to ecosystems, but to function as ecosystems themselves. And so having Vine City as the example, try to function like it's not a wetland is a losing proposition. There's a governing hydrology there that there's no getting around it. And so, I showed you the example of Lower Ninth Ward. Lower Ninth Ward, after Katrina, they had tremendous wildlife problems. And so that becomes an obligation. I mean, some of that wildlife we love, right? So we love the bird noise, I do. It doesn't take long to get away from Atlanta to realize that it is deafening. The bird, I say noise, the beautiful bird song we have. I mean, I've been in rainforests all over the world. I don't hear the bird song that we have in Atlanta. It's tremendous. And so some of the wildlife we love, some of it is truly problematic, and we have to manage it. We're capable of it, but it does suggest that we might have to have different allocations of resources in our city to do different things. So I don't think it's a reason not to do it, and I'm not envisioning a wild forest, but I don't think there's any part of the city that we can say this is just not the right place for trees or nature-based solutions because it's too urban or whatever it is. I think these are mutually reinforcing objectives. So thank you for your question, I hope.
I'm not objecting.
Yeah. No, I said thank you for your question. Thank you for your question. I meant to say question. And I don't know if I repeated that. I apologize. At any rate, thanks everybody for coming out. Thanks for your questions. Really enjoyed it.